Hi, this is Rabbi Chaim Coffman. I want to welcome everyone to our fifth installment of the Parsha of the week, Parshas Chayei. Now, there are a few things, I think interesting things that we want to look at. The first is if we look at the beginning of the Parsha where Sarah dies and Avraham looks for a burial place. So the Torah is very vivid in speaking about this idea. In other words, the Torah says that Sarah dies, and he speaks to the children of Chayei, and he says, I'm an alien, I'm a resident among you, grant me an estate, a burial site, and there's a whole discussion between the children of Chayei and Avraham, and in the end, Ephron says, I'll give you this for free, and they have a whole discussion, and then he says, fine, you want to pay for it, then you can pay, you're going to pay quite a bit, and he ends up paying 400 shekels. He says, what's 400 shekels between me and you? Right, verse 15, chapter 23, verse 15, and he says, what is it, bury your debt? So there's a whole discussion between Avraham and Bnei Chayei, especially the children of Chayei, and especially Ephron. And Ephron, they have a whole discussion, and Ephron says, fine, you want to pay, then you're going to pay through the nose. And paying through the nose, he pays 400 shekels, right? 400 silver shekels, let's make it clear. 400 silver shekels, which was nothing short of a small fortune. At the time, in order that Avram should be able to bury Sarah. Now, there are a number of things here that I think need to be clarified, and that one is that there's an obligation for every Jew to be buried. Now, that goes back to the fact that once Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, God throws him out of the Garden of Eden because God doesn't want him to eat from the tree of life. If he eats from the tree of life, then he would live forever. He wouldn't fulfill or get his atonement for any sin that he had done in this world. So in order to get atonement for any sin, we've spoken previously that you have to die. And once you die, you get buried in the ground. And then God is going to judge what you did in this world, for better or for worse. It'll take all your actions. It'll see where you were holding, what you were doing, what you should have been doing, what your potential was. And then he'll judge it however he judges it. But the most important thing is that the body has to go into the ground. Part of the atonement process, even before the person gets judged, even before that soul gets judged, what's going to happen is that he has to be buried. Now, without being buried, it's a tremendous disgrace for the body. The soul goes through a tremendous, it's very hard for the soul, because the soul, once the person dies, hovers over the body, tries to get back into the body, and can't get back in the body. The soul was thrown into flux, so to speak, doesn't really know what to do until, it finally goes up and gets its judgment. It hovers around its house, etc. That's what the whole Shiva period is of the 7 days of mourning, except on Shabbos you don't mourn publicly, but in general, you have a 7-day mourning period, as long as it doesn't come up against a holiday where that would stop the mourning period. But be that as it may, it's 7 days. That's what Shiva is 7 days. And the soul hovers around the house where it lived. So one of the most important things at a Shiva house, at a mourner's house, is that the mourner speaks about the person who passed away. Now, the purpose of speaking about the person who passed away is to bring out good qualities about the person, what you remember them for, what they did in their lives, right? Hopefully positive things and how other people can gain from what this person was in this world. In a lot of places today, unfortunately, the only thing that's not spoken about in a mourner's house is actually about the mourner. They'll speak about anything else. They'll speak about politics, they'll speak about sports, they'll speak about entertainment, economics. They'll speak about everything else except what's really important. And what's really important is speak about the person who passed away and to bring out their virtues, hopefully, that they have, that they have a lot. And the people come in order that, in order that they comfort the person who is mourning. That's really what the whole purpose is. He speaks about the person who passed away. And he gets comfort from people coming to him. And they sit for however long they sit there. And they say afterwards when they get up to leave, may be comforted like the mourners of Jerusalem. And it's a grieving process. So the soul doesn't have this grieving process. It dies, right? The body dies, and the soul is going to get judged. Part of what the soul goes through is part of its atonement is that it's going to be played, a second movie of what its potential was and what possibly it could have reached, in this world. But imagine, and that's part of what hell is, because they're seeing what they could have done. Not only that, they're seeing what they did in their life. Like their life flashes before them. And they see all these different things, bad things that they did. And since they're a pure soul, they can't do anything else but just nod their spiritual head. I don't know exactly how that works, upstairs, but they have to nod, and you can't lie. You're a pure soul. At this point. So one part of Gehenna, of what hell is that the soul suffers by seeing what it did. And you can't change that. It's like, everything's video recorded here in this world. You have two angels that see every action, and then they give testimony upstairs. So be that as it may, the idea over here is that the soul, at least at this portion, at this time, is hovering around what it knows till it gets called upstairs, right? The house where it lived, where it grew up, other things. So imagine part of this suffering that the soul's going to be, that the soul potentially will go through, is if people sitting around are talking about any other subject. Oh, I remember, imagine someone coming, and the soul is right there, you can't see it. It says, oh, I remember all those things you used to do. You remember all those, X, Y, and Z. You fill in the stupidity of what we've done in this world. And the soul's sitting there like cringing. Like, say something positive. Don't say, oh, look what he did with this or with that or with the other thing. Doesn't mean anything. It's about his actions. What did he do in this world? Right? How much Torah did he keep? How many mitzvahs did he keep? So that's painful for a soul. What's even more painful for a soul is if it doesn't get buried. That, as far as I've seen, and in some of the books that I've gone through, described somewhat what this is like. We can't imagine. We can't imagine what the pain the soul goes through when it doesn't get buried. Not only that, what if it gets delayed to be buried for any number of reasons? And it's tremendous pain for the soul. Something can't even put into words. It's extremely painful. The point is that when a person dies, that's why here in Israel, especially in Jerusalem, the body doesn't lie over 24 hours. Right? The body gets put into the ground straight away for this reason. Outside of Israel, it can depend on a number of factors. Sometimes, family comes in or other things that, can't get buried straight away or whatever. It's painful for the soul. But the bottom line is the body has to go into the ground. Cannot be, for a Jew, cannot be a mausoleum. Part of the atonement process is going into the ground. So what happens? someone's going to ask, well, you can't ask because I'm doing this myself, but someone would ask, well, what happens if they got cremated? If they got cremated against their will, let's say like people in the Holocaust, they died sanctifying God's name. So we're not talking about them. We're talking about people who got cremated willingly. Now, getting cremated has its benefits. It's definitely cheaper. In the bigger scheme of things, it's definitely cheaper than actually having a burial place. But most people want to have a remembrance in this world. That's why they get buried. Even though it might be more economical, to get burned up, to be, cremated. Nonetheless, most people want to have some sort of remembrance. Anyway, if a Jew willingly understands, that he does it with his own mind and his own volition, he's not forced to do this, and he gets cremated, so that's bad. Now, there are a number of reasons why that's bad. One is because you're not allowed to burn the body after it dies. It has to go in the ground. So even if a person got cremated, so the ashes have to be buried in the ground. If the ashes are not buried in the ground, then I can't even imagine what, not only did the soul, not only did the soul have to go through this for whatever reason, but at the same time, it doesn't get put in the ground. So the last of the 13 principles of faith, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam, is that I believe in perfect faith that God is going to resurrect the dead. Now, resurrection, even after a person gets judged, after they die, there's going to be a great judgment. At the end of days, whenever that's going to be. So that resurrection, where everybody gets judged, the entire world's going to get judged. Either you're going to have the merit to get up, or you're not going to have the merit to get up. What happens if somebody willingly gets cremated? Well, you have to have a body to get up. Well, you could say, isn't God going to bring back the dead, even if he got cremated? Couldn't God do that? Yes, he could. Right? But he's going to make a body that's going to come back. So, for God, nothing's impossible. But in order for him to bring a person back, he needs a body, right? He needs bones, he needs something. Right? Again, so what do you say? What about someone who got cremated against their will? So God can bring them back anyway. But someone who did it willingly, it's a much bigger problem, because if you deny this principle, i.e. of resurrection, you deny it by getting cremated. Even if you don't know that's what you're doing, you are denying this principle. This is a main principle of Jewish belief. If you deny this principle, you deny God. Don't pass go, don't collect 200. Game over. Why should God resurrect you? Why should you have that merit to get resurrected? If you deny this, according to this, you shouldn't get resurrected. Again, I'm not playing God. I'm just giving over, what I've seen and what I've learned and what I've been taught. So, God could resurrect someone even if they did get cremated. Right? But simple explanation is, if a person got cremated, then they're not gonna get up at resurrection. So that's one idea about the importance of being buried and the importance of timely burial. So now let's get back to the original question. We had this whole discussion between Ephron and Avram and the children of Chet about this burial place. Why does Avram go to great lengths to get this burial place? So it seems that Avram wanted this specific field and this specific place for his wife because she deserved the best, and he wanted this place for her. So we see, at least from here, that a person has to be buried in the right place. That means that he has to be buried in a place that's fitting for them. Some people Some people want to be buried next to great righteous people. And the problem is they're not holding on that level. And if they're not holding on that level, they could get burned literally or figuratively, because the spiritual level of this person is so great and the other person is so small, not going to look so good upstairs. So I'll give an example. I'll give you a relevant example that happened a number of years ago. My Rabbi, Rav Moshe Sternbuch, Shlita, he should be well, should be strong, told over the following story. He was in South Africa. He spent 6 months, a year, in South Africa, started a community there, and he lived in Israel for 6 months, the rest of the year. So he went back almost 13 years, right? For 13 years, he started this community, and he was part of this community. Basically, until his wife got sick, he stopped going about 20 years ago. And there was a thing going on in South Africa where they were burying non-religious Jews next to religious Jews. Now you might say, so what? Like, what's the big deal if you have a non-religious Jew buried next to a religious Jew? Like, in the bigger scheme of things, who cares? So he brought proof from the Talmud, says that you don't have people buried, next to each other if they were deserving of different deaths. In other words, if someone got a capital punishment for a certain thing, shouldn't be buried next to someone else who had a different capital punishment. They're like different graveyards for different people, let's say. So he said there was this phenomenon going on in South Africa where they were burying non-religious people next to religious people. So came this funeral, and he tried to stop this funeral because he wanted this religious person buried somewhere else. Or let's say, this religious person buried somewhere else. And there was a whole discussion, and there's a whole uproar. The media, television, they basically tried to drive him back to Israel, calling him a fanatic, calling him other things, like, what are you doing trying to stop a funeral? Let the person die in peace. So the head of the Chevra Kadisha, people who bury, people who are in charge of burying the dead, himself wasn't a religious Jew, but he said, listen, you cannot bury a non-religious Jew next to a religious Jew. Why? Because God's going to judge that person, this non-religious Jew, for instance, and he's going to say, did you keep Torah, right? It's one of the first things you're going to be asked. Did you keep Torah? And he says, I keep Torah. He says, what do you mean? I grew up in South Africa. It was very hard to keep Torah, in mitzvahs. Like, what do you want from me? So God says, yeah, but look at the guy sitting next to you, right? The guy lying down next to you was an Orthodox Jew. He also lived in South Africa. He also grew up in South Africa. So how come he could be a religious Jew, but you couldn't? What's the person going to answer? Tremendously embarrassing. Because here, this other person grew up. It doesn't matter what the circumstances were, etc. I'm just talking in generalities. He says, he grew up in South Africa, and he was a religious Jew. So why weren't you a religious Jew? So what that's going to do, it is going to be a tremendous slap in the face, spiritually speaking, to this guy upstairs. What's he going to answer? He has no answer. He can't say, well, I didn't know, and I was this, and I was that, and I couldn't do. What do you mean you couldn't do? Look at the guy sitting right next to you. He's lying down right next to you. He was able to do it. So my Rabbi said, I'm trying to save you from embarrassment and punishment in the next world. That's why you should never bury a religious Jew next to a non-religious Jew. So in the end, the Chevra Kadisha agreed with him and they stopped this practice. But you have to understand that, my Rabbi told me this over, and I saw it written up, and he wrote it up. And the language that he used was very, very strong. So when I asked him about it, he said, you don't understand, what they did to me. Like, they tried to demolish him. The radio, TV, newspapers tried to totally demolish him. For that reason, he had to make a special gathering in his own synagogue to explain to his congregants what in the world was going on, because, they were ready to run him out of the town. So he said. So the point here is that yes, burial is important in order to get atonement, and that's where the atonement process starts. But at the same time, you have to be buried, in a place that is going to be fitting for you to be buried there. Don't say, I want to be buried next to the Rambam, whether you have millions of dollars or not to be able to do it, or whatever, or next to this great rabbi or whatever. It's extremely dangerous to do. Even if you're two religious Jews, if someone's 10 times greater, you don't want to be buried in that same place. It's a danger, spiritually. It's not going to be the same thing as, you weren't religious and he was religious, so, make it look bad. But you have to be buried in the right place. That's why the Talmud says they had different places for people to be buried, so they'd be buried in the same par. They'd be on the same level, so there wouldn't be this time. Trust me. There are going to be plenty of claims against us when we get upstairs after 120 years. As my Rabbi said, let's minimize them. This is a huge, huge thing. Because the embarrassment that a person will get, you won't be able to answer. Right? Imagine, I'll give one example. Imagine someone grew up in a place, and he said, listen, there wasn't really that much Torah there. I couldn't have really learned that much. Well, what if around the surrounding area, there were people that they could have learned from? They just chose not to. So then it depends why they chose not to. Did they choose not to because they just had too much desire and they just were lazy and they didn't want to, they gave in to their evil inclination and they had family issues, they didn't want to, do anything, to hurt the family, God forbid, or anything else. But what if someone grew up in the same place? What if he grew up in the same place and he said, look, this person didn't have it easy. Look at his family. Look what he went through, etc. But he did it. He was able to get past it. And you say, but what about you? So then we can give excuses. We can say, well, my parents didn't do this. Well, this didn't happen. Well, that didn't happen. Yeah, we could use any excuse we want. But what happens after 120 years? We get upstairs. God asks you that question. And you give him 10 excuses why you didn't do it. What if God doesn't accept any of them? What if God says, you know what, you were just lazy. I don't care if you were afraid, you could have done it. Food for thought. That's the first thing I wanted to mention. The second thing is this whole story with Eliezer, Eved Avram. Eliezer was the master of Avram's house, and Avraham sends him on a mission. Avram says, I want you to get a wife for my son, and he makes clear what he's looking for. He says, in chapter 24, he says, swear by the God of Hashem, God of earth, don't take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, rather to my land, my kindred, you shall go, take a wife for my son, for Isaac. Right? It's chapter 21, verse 3 to 6 to 5. And then he says, perhaps the woman's not going to go with me. Avram answered, don't worry. Hashem, God of heaven, who took me out of the house of my father, from the land of my birth, etc. He swore to me, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send an angel before you. You will take a wife from my son there, etc. Don't worry. So Avram says, God's going to be with you. And he swears. He swears to him that this is what he's going to do. And he goes off. So there are a number of questions here. The obvious question is, why didn't Avram do it himself? Right? That's the obvious question. If a person, is involved with their kids, the parents are the ones that try and find the match for their son or their daughter. So Avram should have done it. And then he says, well, don't take from the Canaanites, take from my family. And you want to find a sign that she's a Baalas Chesed, that she does great acts of loving kindness, like Yitzchak's mother, Sarah. It's a big task for someone who runs his household. You're almost looking for a needle in the haystack. So, anyway, he swears, and he goes off, and he says a little prayer, as he gets to a certain place, and he says, if there's a woman, and she'll feed my camels, and then she'll give my camels, that she'll give me to drink, and give my camels to drink, I know this is going to be the right woman. Just as he finishes saying this prayer, Rivka comes out. Now, Rivka's all of 3, and what does she tell him? So Rivka here says that she says in verse 16, verse 18, chapter 24, verse 18. She says, drink, my lord, quickly she'll go to jug. When she finished giving to drink, she says, I'll draw water even for your camels. And they will finish drinking. This is it. Right? Not only does he give him to drink, but he gives his camels to drink. So he had all these camels. Camels drink a lot. Right? As we know. She's all of 3 at this time. Even if she was more well endowed at the age of 3, which Talmud says was the case. Be that as it may, how much camels have to drink? You're talking about, gallons and gallons. And here's this, small girl like going to the well and, bringing up all this water, which brought down that it was pretty miraculous. The bucket went down, came back up, went down, came up, whatever. It was a whole miraculous thing, exactly how it happened. But she's the one that does it. So, it's amazing divine providence that goes on here, right? That's really the essence of what is happening, is to show how God runs the world. But let's backtrack before we get to that. So Avram swears, makes Eliezer swear that this is what he's going to find, and this is what he's looking for, this is what he should, where he should go. Avram tells him, where's the second question first? Avram tells him, do not take from the Canaanites. Go back to my homeland and take from my family. Now, what's so bad about the Canaanites? Obvious, Canaanites were cursed, right? And Eliezer also had a son. Also had a daughter. And his daughter could never marry Yitzchak because he was from Chaim, so he's cursed. So Canaanites, no. Canaanites, we're not interested. We want better stock. But keep in mind that even in his own family, idolaters, etc., even in his own family, it didn't seem like such great stock either, but they were better than the Canaanites. That's why he says, go back to my family. They're definitely better, than the Canaanites. That's one idea. Second idea is, why didn't he go himself? Now, he doesn't go himself. One of the reasons that I thought, which I saw one of the commentaries bring down, one obvious reason, he's too old. Right? He's over 100 years old. He's afraid he wouldn't make it back on the trip. But we have another problem. So, if he's really supposed to look after his son, or look after his daughter, and really help set the match, why does he let Eliezer do it? So you could say he lets him do it because he's too old, he's afraid he's going to die. Also, another possible reason is because Eliezer seemed to know more about his son than Avram did. to the extent, character traits, strengths, etc. So he was better. He was better, I guess, character judge in that sense than Avram himself. The other thing is that Avram, even though he's supposed to look after his son, and the idea of education, just as a side point, is that a parent has an obligation to educate their child even after bar mitzvah, right? To make sure they go in the right path. And also, there's an obligation to help them get married. So, that doesn't stop even after they get married, right? Obviously, at a certain level, you're not going to interfere, but you want to make sure that they're going on the right path. So, like, education to a child never ends. When we say the blessing, when the child hits bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, or really, a male child, when he hits bar mitzvah, that the parent, the father that's called up to the Torah will say, Baruch shepatrani me'oin shel zeh. I am exempt from the punishment of this child. And I remember growing up, people always used to get a chuckle, and laugh at, oh, that's so cute. No, it's not cute. It means that if the child does anything, from this point on, child's liable. In other words, the parent, the father's liability is less if the child does something wrong. But in the bigger scheme of things, and this is what is pretty scary, at least when it comes to child education, and that is that that if you raise a child a certain way, you want them to go in the ways of the Torah, and they rebel. They don't. They go off and do whatever. So, it happens even in the best of homes. The idea is that the parents at some level are certainly responsible. Talmud says the Torah is not a Yerusha. Torah is not an inheritance because a father may be a great rabbi and his father may be a great rabbi. His grandkids or great-grandkids may not be. They may not be great Torah scholars. So there's no guarantee. We have to educate them to the best of our ability. We have to give them the best chance to succeed in Torah. That means giving them a top-rate education, not some Mickey Mouse education and hoping for the best. Yeah, imagine, a parent says, okay, my kid went to public school, and he went to, he went to Hebrew school 2 days a week, or 3 days a week. We kept, a little bit of the holidays. I can't believe my kid intermarried, right? Went off to college. Can't believe my kid intermarried. What do you mean you can't believe your kid intermarried? You never gave him a fighting chance. Giving him a fighting chance means you educate him properly. You send him to the best school for Torah that he can grow spiritually. Again, there's no guarantee. There's no special formula. We're not cookie cutters. Not everyone fits in the exact same mold. But if you don't give him the chance and you give him a half-baked education at best, then a person's going to say, I can't believe my kid came out like this. And the answer is, you didn't give him anything. You didn't give him the tools. If you didn't give him the tools, what do you expect? But I didn't expect he'd fall in love and marry a non-Jew. Are you kidding me? You thought they were just going to hang out, be friends, oh, sorry, I can't marry you. You're not Jewish. But why? I don't know, but we just don't do that. But why? I'm sorry, I can't talk about this, but I can only marry a Jew. That makes no sense. Most people will never stand up to such a test. So, you want to have Jewish grandchildren? Kids have to marry Jewish. If not, then the result will be what we see today. 60-70% intermarriage. And of that, you have 70-80% of those children don't get any Jewish education. None. I'm not even talking half-baked bad. I'm talking zero. Goose egg. Recipe for disaster. Yes, that's what we see. So the main culprit here, in most cases, is ignorance. Lack of priorities. Ignorance and lack of priorities means same thing. Lack of education. 2 days a week, when you're fighting against, basketball or other sports or music or who knows what, what's going to take priority? What's going to take precedence? So the big thing is that we want Jewish continuity. Jewish continuity stops at intermarriage. One generation, gone. Doesn't matter if it's a man marrying a Jewish woman. The child, yes, is Jewish. Even if the child's Jewish, what kind of Jew is it going to be? You might say, well, you got to give it free will, okay? So let him choose. Maybe it'll be a mixture. Maybe it'll be a hodgepodge. Maybe, whatever it is. The bottom line is, if it's not authentic, and it's not real, and it's not made to be lived by, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Judaism in that way will die. And we see that clear as day. Will die. Just a matter of time. So Avram tells Eliezer, I want you to get me a wife for Yitzchak that is going to meet this criteria. Obviously, it can't be for someone who's cursed. And obviously, it has to be someone, fitting to be part of our house. That's what any parent wants. Right? Again, you have to go on the strengths, of your child and what they're looking for in order to find that. There's another question that really has to be addressed, and that is, we mentioned why Abraham doesn't go, why he doesn't do it himself. But Talmud says, pretty clear, that a husband, if he wants to marry a woman, has to see her. Can't do it without seeing her. Right? How does he know what he's getting? He has to be attracted. There has to be attraction. Love comes later. Right? But at least there has to be some level of attraction. There has to, you have to see each other. So how could Yitzchak not? How could Avram had set this up that Yitzchak that they wouldn't see each other? So one explanation possibly is the fact that even though it's true he didn't see her, but he's relying on his father. Right? His father's not going to lead him astray. Okay, his father's taste might not be necessarily his taste. But if he really believed and had proper faith in who his father was and how God runs the world, that wouldn't be an issue. They might say, okay, that might be a cop-out, somewhat of a cop-out answer. And Yitzchak does meet her when she comes, and he takes her in the tent, and all the things that went on in the tent of Sarah came back when Rivka came in, and the Torah says that Yitzchak was consoled by the death of his mother through Rivka, and they get married. So that's another another idea. I think the most important idea here is look how divine providence works. Here, it's pretty amazing. People get married in any way, shape, or form. Even somebody you don't think, oh, this guy is, he's nerdy, he's this, he's that, but people get married. There are, plenty of stories of people who get married much older or, God forbid, don't get married, but most people do get married. And, some people it's easier, some people it's more difficult. But at the end of the day, the vast majority get married, and it boggles the mind. Because, you grew up a certain way, you were raised a certain way, socioeconomic was up and down, or up or down, or whatever the case is. You had certain siblings going through certain trials and tribulations, and then you have to meet your other half to be one. Right? That's why the man has to give over the ring, because he's lacking something. What's the man lacking? The other part of his soul, right? That's the woman. So, I think it's nothing short of miraculous that anybody gets together. That, if a person meets and it sticks and it works, at least, in general, even though according to the world population, divorce rate is over 60%. Within the Orthodox community, it's probably less than 3%. So it shows that it works. Someone once told me, it's rising, and more younger people are getting divorced. Yeah, that might be true. But again, if you're comparing it to 60%, if we hit 10%, we'll call it an epidemic. We're not even at 3%, if that. And 3% is too much. It's 3% too much. Shouldn't be divorced. If there needs to be divorce, there can be. And then it's a mitzvah to get divorced. But, in the bigger scheme of things, we don't want anyone to get divorced. So, God is busy, Talmud says, making matches and putting people together. But people can meet each other from like one end of the world to the other. I can tell you just a personal anecdote that, when I came to Israel when I was 23, and I said for sure, it's never ever going to happen, I'll marry an American. So what happened? 6 months later, I met my wife. She's American, and, 23 years later, still married. So you can say, no. God's going to say, oh, watch this. watch this. And, my wife will always say, but if you would have married an Israeli, they would never would have understood any of your jokes. Well, that might be true. Nonetheless, you can think one way. God's going to say, let me show you something different. So, you spend your life, or at least part of your life, looking for that, other half, and that other half blends. And if, God forbid, they get divorced and they were the right people to be together, we could blow it. In other words, God could say, this is your right half. This is who you're supposed to be married to. Oh, but you didn't work on your marriage, and, other things happen, you end up getting divorced. That was the right one. You just blew it. All right, that can also happen if you marry the wrong one. So I'll tell you a quick story. There was a book. I never got past the introduction because it scared the absolute wits out of me. And at the introduction of this book, it was about marriage. And as Rabbi was saying, this decision doesn't just affect you. It affects your kids. It affects your wife, and it affects your kids, and it affects all future generations down the line. I'm like, who, me? No, shut the book. I was like, no, that's too much. I never got past the introduction. But there's a reality. The reality is the decision you make affects future generations. Now, let's say a Jew, for the sake of argument, marries a Jew, but they don't marry the right one. Let's say it's not the right one you were supposed to marry. Also has an effect, all the more so what happens if you marry a non-Jew. So those future Jewish lines are not there. In other words, that spiritual line is cut off. Certainly if it's a male marrying a female. If it's a female Jew marrying a non-Jew, okay, the Jew's still Jewish. The child, is still Jewish. But eventually, that line could be cut spiritually. So if you marry, now, the repercussions are like this. So if you marry the wrong person, i.e. a Jew marries a non-Jew, that means that other soul, that other half soul gets messed up also. And the children that you were supposed to have don't exist. And then there's a whole bunch of repercussions that go on and on and on. It's tragic. Tragic. But the reality is there's 60% into marriage. So you can say, well, if God designed the world, and you're bringing up this whole thing about Hashgacha Pratis and divine providence, and how God set people up, and we see from the story here, so where does intermarriage come in? So intermarriage comes in because people have free choice. And we can make the right choice, and we make the wrong choice. And we can't come upstairs after I'm 20 years and say, God, you caused me this, that, and the other thing. God's going to say, I didn't do that. You made that decision. Right? Sometimes when we suffer and we think, one of the commentaries in the book of Job says that, oh, you're going to blame God because you think he did this with X, Y, and Z? You made a bad decision. Because you made a bad decision, there are repercussions. Because of the repercussions, you can say that's God's fault. That's your fault. 614th commandment. Don't forget. Don't be stupid. You did something stupid. There are repercussions. That's not God's fault. He didn't make you stupid. You made a wrong decision. And because you made a wrong decision, then there are going to be repercussions. In this case also, tremendous repercussions. So God says, of course I put people together. Of course I'm behind the scenes. And I'm doing all this. How else could you imagine it? A person, let's say, goes to work for a certain company. And he moves to another city. And he meets somebody. This person has a whole story how they got to this company, whatever. That's how they meet, they fall in love, and they get married. Boy, what a coincidence. Yeah, you could look at it that way. Or you could look at all these different events that happened to them and put them at the right place at the right time. Again, into marriage at the wrong place at the wrong time. Because you weren't supposed to do that. As a Jew. A non-Jew doesn't have a problem. It's the Jew's problem. So when you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, you make that decision and it affects all these generations and different things. Has all these repercussions. We have no one to blame but ourselves. But why did God do that? He didn't do that. You did that. And then you're going to have to deal with what the repercussions are. Keep this in mind. That there were 2 million or 3 million people on Mount Sinai. According to regular statistics of people getting married, having children, etc., the Jewish population should be about 150 million. Give or take. 150 million, we're about 10% if we're lucky. About 15 million, 14.5 million, let's say. What happened to 136 million? So I heard a great rabbi once say, you want to know what happened? People got killed off. There were holocausts. There were pogroms. And people died. True. The rest assimilated. That is the scary part. 136 million people? It's a lot of people. So, I deal pretty much people who want to convert to Judaism. So I once mentioned how a convert who wants to come to Judaism, their soul was also on Mount Sinai. They also heard the Torah on Mount Sinai, but their soul got messed up. And now they have to go through this process called conversion. So someone once asked, what do you mean a soul got messed up? How can a soul get messed up? I said, very easy. Let's say the person's a male, intermarries. Next generation, not Jewish. That's it. Finished. That family line, according to that person, wiped off the face of the map spiritually. Multiply that exponentially, this is what you have. Boy, pretty negative. But in the bigger scheme of things, we see from here, try and end on a positive. In the bigger scheme of things, we see that God runs the world. No matter what happens, He's the one orchestrating, even if we don't understand it. There's a mitzvah in the Torah for the Jewish people to believe that God runs the world. This idea of hashgacha pratis, or if you want to speak modern Hebrew, hashgachat pratit, or yeshivish hashgacha pratis, means divine providence. So how do we know there's divine providence in the world? How do we know God intervenes in history? Exodus chapter 20. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God. How do I know? The Torah says that you are the Lord my God, because I took you out of Egypt. Commentaries ask, if that's true, What happened to Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz? What happened in Genesis chapter 1? Verse 1. God created the heavens and the earth. Isn't that a better proof? Yeah, it's a better proof. The only problem is who was there to witness it. Nobody. There's nobody there. Who gives testimony to the fact that God intervened in history? They took us out of Egypt. Oh, about 2-3 million people. That's what happened at Mount Sinai. And they passed it down generation to generation. That's what the Passover Seder is. One event in history, but everyone around the world does the same thing. They have 3 matzahs. They have 4 cups of wine. They have the cup for Elijah. It's all the same. Go to any Jewish community in the world. It's all the same. You have a mezuzah on your door. What's inside the mezuzah? Parshas talks about coming out of Egypt. What about the evening service? All about coming out of Egypt. You say Kiddush Friday night, Zechu Yetzias Mitzrayim. We remember coming out of Egypt. Everything in Judaism, a lot of it, I shouldn't say everything, a lot of it has to do with the coming out of Egypt. Boy, if it didn't happen, we're in big trouble. One event in history passed down generations. People will ask, but that happened so long ago. You're right. But imagine in the Passover Seder, there used to be 4 generations. 4. There used to be a great-grandfather, a grandfather, a father, and a son. At one time, that little son, that great-grandfather was the little son. If you have 80 of those generations, that's not so far back. 80 of those generations goes to giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. That's a pretty incredible thing. Yeah, God can split the sea. He can take the Jewish people out, give them the Torah. It's also something just as miraculous. God puts husband and wife together. That is pretty miraculous. Also, combining different upbringings, different ideas, different life situations, to put them together in order that they unite to become one and have children, etc. Nothing short of miraculous. So Avram says, swear to me, you're going to do this, and God is going to help you along the way. Eliezer bows down twice. He bows down once at the beginning, and then once before he leaves, when he takes Rivka back. Why does he bow? Because it gives credibility or credence to the God above who set this all up. Because he made this prayer, and exactly after he finished, that's when it happened. Now, we don't see things happen that quickly, true. But if we look in our lives, and we see what goes on in our lives, we see divine providence, at different levels. That's the essence of what's going on over here, that Avram sends Eliezer, and Eliezer brings back Rivka. Tremendous amount of divine providence. We'll see the same thing by Yaakov and Rachel. Right? Yaakov's fleeing for his life, and he ends up by Lavan, and as he sees these animals out and about, and he sees Rachel come out. It's all divine providence there. They meet at a well, right? Where Rivka met at a well. There's also significance of that. But it's to show you God is there. Here it's more direct, right? Doesn't mean that God's not there, otherwise. We just have to have the ability to be able to see Him and be able to witness to witnesses. Again, I just want to mention that I give these classes to converts. Anyone interested can take a look at my Facebook page, Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism, or my blog, rabbichaimcoffman.blogspot.com, rabbi.blogspot, CHIAIM, Rabbi Chaim Coffman, .blogspot, blogspot.com. Everyone have a great Shabbos.